Ever since the times of scientific socialism, the extreme left has consistently sought to convince the vast mentally sane majority of the population that their delusions are inevitable. Moreover, since the infiltration of the far left into the academe, the language referring to our common history has been infected by this kind of thinking, to the extent that we now refer to historical events as inevitable, even as we perfectly know very well that it wasn't the case at all. Nothing is inevitable in politics. It's always a question of price or of trade-offs. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is something that's been bothering me for quite a while now, but since time is becoming this increasingly scarce commodity, it remained unaddressed on this channel as a standalone theme. Because otherwise, the issue did come up several times during the current year, most often during the videos I made from Sweden, in which my co-host from there, Paul, made the highly astute point that the total obliteration of Sweden is not something inevitable, but rather that the more time goes on without something being done, the more blood, sweat and tears it will cost to address the issue. And this is really the whole point. The myth of inevitability starts with the codification of Marxism and socialism. And I say this because leftism in general has been around for a lot longer than Marx himself, only it was known as the politics of envy. We'll explain that in another video that I'll call All Ideas Are Old, but in any event, one of the first innovations that followed the codification of socialism was precisely this myth of inevitability, known in socialist circles as scientific socialism. The topic of scientific socialism has essentially disappeared from political discussion even among leftists, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, because, well, essentially all of the assertions of the initial proposition have been proven wrong. Now, I don't want to spend too much time explaining an idea that even leftists think it was essentially wrong, but the short version is this. In late 1800s, Friedrich Engels wrote an essay in which he argued that there is such thing as utopian socialism and also scientific socialism. Engels argued that pre-Marxist socialism was essentially utopian, and in this critique he went harshly after the French socialists who were following the revolutionary tradition of, well, the French Revolution. In contrast to what Engels called utopian socialism, he was proposing that henceforth the socialists should follow the path of scientific socialism. Under this framework, he argued, socialism could not only be better implemented, but if followed patiently and systemically, it would essentially make its implementation inevitable. Engels believed that socialism is not just another political and/or social theory, but science, and like any other science was thus empirical, and if you just follow the evidence, the conclusion will just present itself. Basically, he believed socialism was inevitable. Now, Marx died in 1883 and Engels died in 1895. Before he died, Engels insisted that if the tenets of scientific socialism are closely followed, world socialism will for sure become a reality, even if it will happen several decades after his death. The problem is that it didn't. In fact, except Tsarist Russia, and even there with German money and with top-down civil war, and not naturally as scientific socialism had predicted, the socialist revolution predicted by the scientific socialists did not come. The situation in the 1920s was quite far from a natural, bottom-up, inevitable world socialist revolution as the original proponents had predicted. Even in other places where it had spread, such as the Bela Kun and György Lukács Bolshevik government in Hungary in 1919, it was still a top-down thing. In fact, the brief existence of the Hungarian Soviet Republic was marked by severe opposition by the proletariat against the regime. So under these conditions, a new school of thought within Marxism formed. That school of thought was to be known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was formed precisely because they have seen that the predictions of scientific socialism did not materialize, and it was thus obvious to them that something was wrong. So they started working on figuring out what went wrong and if there's anything they can correct in the theory in order to fix the prophecy, essentially. Now, I trust this audience to know how things went from here on, so I won't repeat the story of the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism in general. What I will mention, though, is that the new theories that emerged from the work of the Frankfurt School did include quite a lot of baggage from the previous theories, and one of these old elements was the myth of inevitability. And since many of the subsequent conscious and unconscious followers of the Frankfurt School went on to work, and I would argue infiltrate in the academia in various countries in the world, they carried on with them the underlying assumptions of the work of the Frankfurt School, including the assumptions inherited from the scientific socialism school of thought. And as a result of this, the revolutionary myth of inevitability seeped into many other disciplines that, at a first glance, would appear to be unrelated. For instance, it is not uncommon to read that the collapse of the Roman Empire was inevitable. Except it wasn't. We can trace back the collapse of the Roman Empire to a collection of events, each and one of them relevant to the final event, namely the collapse. But we can also safely say that if one or several of those events had gone differently, then the collapse of the Roman Empire would not have happened when it happened. The latter part of the analysis has all but disappeared in the last 40 or 50 years, as if suddenly nobody is interested anymore in how or if it could have been averted. Another example is the French Revolution. Up until 50-something years ago, historical analysis on the French Revolution went something like this. Look, the king and the monarchy in general fucked it up. And to make things worse, many of them did not even realize just how much they had fucked things up, so as a result, eventually, the revolution happened. And then, from that moment on, historians concerned themselves to studying the extent of how bad things were and to figure out all the steps to the revolution with a view to figure out how could the revolution have been prevented. In the last several decades, though, a new school of thought emerged, namely the school of thought that the French Revolution was inevitable. Now, this latter narrative has not yet been entirely successful, but it has nevertheless captured the minds of quite a significant portion of intellectuals, historians, and other thinkers. But even though it did not capture the entire field, it did influence the framing of the dominant narrative. Nowadays, you have serious historians talking about human rights concerns amongst the revolutionaries. This is essentially pure garbage. But it is one of the many signs of the ills that plague modern-day intellectual inquiry about history, namely to project modern-day understandings upon events from the past. To make things short, Maximilien Robespierre himself did not believe that what he himself was doing was inevitable. But with enough scientific socialist indoctrination into the intellectual class, you can essentially introduce outright falsehoods into the contemporary narrative about a historical event. Alright, so what does all of this have to do with present day? Well, everything really. Because in the current year, rarely a day goes by without hearing from some politician, bureaucrat, or political commentator that something is inevitable and that it will happen no matter what we say or think concerning the particular event. For instance, the Brussels bureaucrats tell us that the inevitable future of Europe is multicultural and multiracial. Now, you don't have to be a political scientist, a prime minister, or even someone who is very astute in political thought to smell the nonsense in that statement. The cold hard truth is that this is not inevitable at all. Europe did not become a multiracial, multicultural blob in historical periods that were far more violent than the current period. So the idea that it's inevitable strikes any normal person as absurd. Mind you, this doesn't necessarily mean it will not happen. It just means it is not inevitable. Here's another example. Gun rights in Europe. For the last 20 years, normal people on both sides of the Atlantic have been hearing that it is inevitable that societies will go more and more gun-free and that the Texas-like state of affairs will be forgotten much sooner than most would dare to think. Well, as it turns out, this hasn't happened. In fact, the opposite is happening. Czech Republic just got its own Second Amendment. Citizens are arming themselves up in Austria, Germany, Sweden, Republic of Georgia, Ukraine or Italy. Gun policies are, for the most part, shifting in the direction of more freedom rather than more control. Now, that's not to say the agents of totalitarianism aren't doing their best to fulfill their inevitable prophecy. Just as we speak, the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is trying to shove down the throats of its slave states a bill that Lenin himself would have given a standing ovation on the topic of armed civilians. But the European Union is weaker than ever before. Now, I don't know what will happen in the future, but here's the kicker. Neither do those who claim the inevitability of their own ideas. The bottom line, and here I'll end with what I started, is that nothing is inevitable. The logical follow-up to Thomas Sowell's postulate that there are no solutions, only trade-offs, is that nothing is inevitable, it's all about the costs. So for instance, a total disaster in Sweden is not inevitable. It's only a question of how much blood, sweat and tears are the people willing to spend to avoid it. And it can be avoided, mind you. Same with the continuation of the mental disorder that is the European Union. The EU's continued domination is not inevitable. It's only the question of how much blood, sweat and tears are we willing to spend to change things around. And when it comes to the European Union, it's not even a question of blood as much as it's a question of sweat and tears. It takes a bit of hard work and the tears of the minuscule class that benefits from the European Union. And that bit of hard work isn't even that hard. Saying no is usually all it takes most of the time. But, just like in most cases in history, the longer time it passes, the higher will be the costs. Today it takes only to say no to stop it. 10 years from now, the costs may be much higher. So, I guess in addition to the matter of blood, sweat and tears, there's also a question of the sense of emergency. How much of a sense of emergency do people have over an issue? And especially, how much of a sense of emergency do agents of liberty have? Because the latter question matters more. As I said in other videos, change doesn't require 50% plus one agreement. Most of the time, 20% is more than enough. So, think about that. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and my social media, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.